The Faith and Science Lecture Forum welcomes you to the Galleria Center in Atlanta, Georgia. This evening, Dr. Ravi Zacharias will address the question, is there meaning in evil and suffering? Joining Ravi will be panelists Dr. Bernard Leikind, Dr. Jitendra Mohanty, and Dr. William Lane Craig. Our moderator is J. Kirby Anderson.
The world is a place that is ruled by injustice, lacking in truth, a place that is all too often where the weak are slaughtered by the strong, where the indiscriminate destruction of innocent life is passively observed. The acknowledgement that evil and suffering exist and affects all of our lives has led many to conclude that God, if he exists at all, is either indifferent, impotent, or even sadistic. For others, the problem of evil and suffering does not speak to the existence of God, nor his character. The universe and that all that it contains is a product of mere chance, a collection of molecules that ultimately led to the consciousness of man. The problem, therefore, of evil and suffering is one of man's intellect and his will to survive, a problem that, given time, education, and enlightenment, will ultimately be corrected. For the Christian, the problem of evil and suffering, while difficult to understand, does not nullify the existence of God nor speak to his character, but rather shows his benevolence, his patience, and forbearance. Tonight, we are going to discuss this most difficult of questions. If God is a benevolent, all-powerful deity, how is it that he tolerates evil and allows mankind to suffer? To address this difficult question and to do it in a scholarly and rigorous manner, the Faith and Science Lecture Forum has invited Dr. Ravi Zacharias to address tonight's event. Dr. Zacharias received his Master's of Divinity degree from Trinity Divinity College and has been conferred 2 doctorates of divinity from Asbury and Houghton colleges. He has been an invited lecturer at Cambridge University and has authored numerous books, including Can Man Live Without God? And Deliver Us from Evil, Restoring the Soul in a Declining Civilization. Please welcome with me now as we introduce Dr. Ravi Zacharias to tonight's event.
Thank you, Dr. Tumlin, and it's really a delight for me to be here this evening and have this opportunity to present these thoughts to you. I'm honored that Dr. Bernard Leikind, Dr. Jitendra Mohanty, and Dr. William Lane Craig will be participants even as we interact on these very, very rigorous issues, an issue that each one of them has given serious thought to. And when Jim Tumlin invited me to come and address this, I knew one thing would be established beyond a reasonable doubt after the evening is over. When you consider the scholarship of these gentlemen who we'll be interacting with, my willingness to come here and address the subject will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that some suffering is voluntary. And I have no doubt about that. The closer the deadline came, the more I began to ask myself, why on earth did you get into this? It's a little bit reminiscent of C.S. Lewis, who wrote one of the most powerful books on the subject, The Problem of Pain, in which at one point he says, if only this toothache would go away, I could write another chapter on the problem of pain. But here we are dealing with this, and I believe it is reflective of your interest and the interests of people in many parts of the globe who are tuning in and listening in at the same time. Andrew Fletcher, the 18th century's Scottish political activist, made this comment. When you think of the remarkable foresight he had in saying this, you'll see how appropriate it is for our time. Let me write the songs of a nation, and I don't care who writes its laws. Let me write the songs of a nation, and I don't care who writes its laws. What Andrew Fletcher was really envisioning or reflecting is that the artists, the musicians in particular, reflect the ethos and the pathos of a culture. They do not have to worry about being academically precise. They express the existential struggle that they go through in many areas of living. And this indeed is one of them. In our time, the songwriters address the issue just as cogently. Some years ago, the Moody Blues put it in these words: why do we never get an answer when we're knocking on the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door? One can sympathize with that, and the cry resonates within each one of us. But you know, the one thing I noticed with every author or artist who addressed this issue, the treatment generally began with a long litany or a list of all the atrocities and tragedies that we have witnessed either in that week or in our generation or in the previous century. It seems, although they feel compelled to establish the point in its direst reality. And the more you begin to read authors on this, that is where almost everyone begins. But there was another very subtle fact I noticed, that many of them, while they knew where to begin in raising the question, struggled in where to begin while giving the answer. That, I believe, is an immense and a real challenge. Some years ago, the Far Side comic strip was picturing a massive butlers' convention going on in a hotel. Thousands of butlers in their tuxedos had gathered, but ironically, the focus of attention was in the center of the ballroom, where one butler was lying stabbed to death. And an investigator with his assistant was standing looking at this butler stabbed to death, looking at a room full of butlers, and looking at his colleague and saying, "I hate to begin a week this way." Who done it in a butler's convention presents a very, very difficult challenge for an investigator. And when you're dealing with the problem of evil, you very quickly begin to recognize that it is not merely a problem. Even the problem itself is multifaceted. But what's real, I believe, is the entanglements soon make it look more like a mystery. Now, let me say this very clearly right from the beginning. When I use the word mystery, I am not at all suggesting that, therefore, it does not need any explanatory power. I'm only suggesting to you that there are many converging lines of evidence, both from logic and from experience, that one will need to bring. But I like what Gabriel Marcel said in distinguishing a mystery from a problem. Here's what he said. He said, a mystery is a problem that encroaches upon itself because the questioner becomes the object of the question. A mystery is a problem that encroaches upon itself because the questioner becomes the object of the question. Getting to Mars, said Marcel, is a problem. Falling in love is a mystery. You get involved in some way. You are very much part of the very question you are raising. But let me begin. I would like to lay out some initial thoughts for you and then begin the challenge to the views that will question the Christian worldview. First, the reality of evil and suffering. David Hume said it this way: were a stranger to drop suddenly into this world, I would show him as a specimen of its ills, a hospital full of diseases, a prison crowded with malefactors and debtors, a field strewn with carcasses, a fleet floundering in the ocean, a nation languishing under tyranny, famine, and pestilence. Honestly, I don't see how you can possibly square with an ultimate purpose of love. Another existentialist put it in these words: it is not science that has led me to doubt the purpose of God. It is the state of this world. It is this pitiless, unending struggle for existence among the nations. It is the collapse of our idealisms before the brute facts of force and chaos, that there is a radical twist in the very constitution of the universe which will always defeat man's hopes, make havoc of his dreams, and bring his pathetic optimism crashing in disaster. Purpose? Look at the world. That settles it for me. Clearly, there is a reality of evil and suffering. But secondly is the universality of it. Gautama, the Buddha, who is the progenitor basically of what we call Buddhistic thought, used the word dukkha. Now, dukkha is a word which carries an awful lot with it. It is not fair to merely represent it with the concept of suffering. It brings a weightier matter, the concept of impermanence. But what prompted the Buddha to deal with the issue was as he saw the reality of suffering, whether it was old age or sickness or death, he began to recognize that life was embattled by this reality. And as he began to find an answer, what prompted him was the reality of this, the impermanence that he saw, the transitoriness, and certainly the angst, the anguish of existence. So there is the reality of it, the universality of it, and then there is the complexity of it. When you deal with this problem, you may deal with it metaphysically, the very source of evil and suffering. The physical aspect, dealing with natural disasters. The moral aspect, how can an all-powerful or an all-loving God actually allow this? But as wide-ranging as these possibilities are, when you funnel them down, ladies and gentlemen, there are two distinct tracks on which you can step onto the problem. One is clearly the intellectual aspect of it. Truly, for the Christian theist, if God indeed, as the Bible reveals him to be, is in his sovereignty and power and loving nature, running the affairs of this world and superintending, then is there not the legitimate question behind it all, the question of how or why? So you can deal with this intellectually, or you can deal with it from the emotional or the practical aspect of it. You see, if I were to stand here, for example, and try to explain Augustine's answer to this, or some contemporary philosopher's answer to this, and you have just lost a child in the last week, all of a sudden these theorizings will seem so far away from what it is you're really looking for. So both of these are real, and there is a place in which they have their legitimacy. I will try to draw some from the intellectual struggle and some from the existential or the emotional aspect. And obviously, we can't deal with it in any comprehensive sense. Hopefully, as the other gentlemen join me on the panel and in our interaction, some of the issues that have not been raised here might also surface. But as I begin, I want you to pause now and bear this in mind. Every worldview has to deal with the problem. Every worldview has to deal with the problem. Whether you come from a theistic viewpoint, an atheistic viewpoint, a pantheistic viewpoint, there is such a weightedness to this issue that in some way it has to be either explained or, as some might try to even explain away. And when every worldview deals with it, you'll notice something very fascinating. Number one is this: subsumed in every answer you will find, or assumed in every answer, is the purpose of life that has been assigned by that worldview. Do you follow what I'm saying? When you're dealing with an explanation of evil or suffering, you have assumed within your answer what the purpose is for human existence. C.S. Lewis says when a ship goes into the high seas, it has to answer three questions. Number one, how to keep from sinking. Number two, how to keep from bumping into other ships. And number three, why is it out there in the first place anyway? How to keep from sinking may be personal ethics. How to keep from bumping into other ships may be social ethics. Why is it out there in the first place is essential ethics. And most secular humanists I have read or interacted with have assigned no established purpose, and we will sustain this as we go. So my beginning point here is to present a challenge, first of all, to the naturalist, the one who denies the existence of God, or even to the religious atheist, as Dr. Mohanty will be representing today, that position. You may find that a strange term, but he's very comfortable with describing his position and representing it that way. So explicitly, I will be dealing with the naturalist, but implicitly, I believe we will be addressing even the issues that we'll be interacting on later on with the others. I borrow a metaphor from Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher, to begin my challenge. Sartre wrote a book some years ago called No Exit. In that, he pictured the struggle of an individual or of humanity doomed to find meaning in a meaningless world and struggling to accept this to escape this thrustness, this nihilistic sense that just impedes your day-to-day existence, how an individual can try to break away from this. And he said there was really no exit from the reality of that kind of meaninglessness. And what I want to say to you is this, that the naturalist, in trying to escape or challenge the theistic framework, looks for doors through which to make the exit, and I'm suggesting those doors are marked no exit. Let me sustain those points for you. The first door is the evidential challenge that wants to take leave of God. If one grants the presence of evil, they say, then you cannot really talk about a viable entity, an all-powerful and an all-loving God. I remember being at the University of Nottingham where a student shot up from his chair and said to me, there's too much of evil in this world, there cannot be a God. And I said to him, but sir, when you say there's such a thing as evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? Yes, he said. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He struggled for a while and he said, yes, I will grant you that. I said, but when you say there's such a thing as a moral law, are you not in some way assuming a moral lawgiver? Because if there is no moral lawgiver, there is no moral law. If there is no moral law, there is no absolute good. If there is no good, there is no evil. What is your question? Because you're trying to disprove the moral lawgiver. You know, he stood there staring at me and he says to me, what then am I asking you? Now, maybe he was not as sophisticated in his ability to untangle this and felt somewhat trapped by it. But let me tell you this. People even more sophisticated than him have struggled with this issue. When Bertrand Russell was debating the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston looked at him and said, Mr. Russell, do you believe in good and bad? Russell said, yes, I do. How do you differentiate between good and bad? Russell says, the same way I differentiate between yellow and blue. But how you differentiate between yellow and blue? By seeing, don't you? Yes. How then do you differentiate between good and bad? Bertrand Russell said, on the basis of my feeling, what else? Now, you know, Copleston was a kind man, but somebody could have easily turned to Russell and said, in some cultures they love their neighbors, in other cultures they eat them, both on the basis of feeling. Do you have any personal preference in the matter? Now, just in case you think this is a straw man that is being set up, let me present it to you syllogistically here. Objective moral values exist only if God exists. Objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. Now, in the first premise here, objective moral values exist only if God exists. This is challenged, of course, by the naturalist, challenged by the skeptic, and he or she says, I don't have to accept that. But I'll tell you what, the struggle that they find when they turn away from objective moral values is a monumental struggle, because the fact of the matter is, outside of God, they are not able to anchor objective moral values, and yet intuitively they know that some objective moral values can be so certain within your own mind. And yet, unable to anchor it, they move away then from that to try and come out with some other explanation, maybe a very subjective notion of this. Now, I want you to follow the argument, because I want to trace for you how the questioner here gets encroached within the problem, and the mystery really draws the questioner in. Probably one of the strongest voices against the Christian worldview is J.L. Mackie, who brought the evidential argument from evil to light, saying that with the presence of evil, this is a strong argument against the existence of God. But even J.L. Mackie said this: we might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features supervenient upon natural ones constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. Did you hear that? We might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features, supervenient upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. And so the skeptic is ending up with a serious problem to try and explain how an impersonal, amoral first cause through a non-moral process produces a moral basis for life. Mackey says, when you start talking about objective ethics, it presents such an awkward problem for us that you almost have to invoke the reality of a transcendent being. But since it is so awkward to do that, he moves towards a subjective notion of ethics. What then happens if you move away from the objectivity of good? What happens to the problem of evil? There's a short step. Listen to Richard Dawkins of Oxford University, the renowned anti-theistic thinker. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So from denying the moral lawgiver, as it were, and not finding a point of grounding for objective good, finally they move secondarily to the step that maybe even evil as we see it does not really have an objective reality to it. If that is the case, you move then to the third step, and you begin to see how the mystery now truly suctions in the individual who presents as the challenge to theism. Hobart Maurer, one-time professor at Harvard and Yale, an American president of the American Psychological Association who committed suicide several years ago, made this comment in an article. He was not a Christian by any stretch of the definition of the terms here. But listen to what he says. For several decades, we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus, and we've acclaimed our liberation from sin as epoch-making. But at length we have discovered that to be free in this sense, that is to be sick rather than being sinful, is to court the danger of also becoming lost. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deeper sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics now find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? What does living really mean? This is a secular thinker saying this. In removing objective good and moving away from the objective notion of evil and taking away this vertical dimension that psychologists were so want to resist in the notion of sin, he said all of a sudden we've lost the very roots of our being, and we now wander around like neurotics asking ourselves, who am I? This internal inconsistency from the questioner who raises the problem of evil has therefore become the object of satire by some very good thinkers. G.K. Chesterton is a case in point. Listen to how he says it. All denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind, and the modern skeptic doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. Thus he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life. Then as a philosopher, that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, and then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is forever engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt becomes practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything. Door number one, nothing normative. It's marked no exit. Door number two, but we can be good without God, someone might say. Harvard biologist Edward O. Wilson published a massive piece of work in which he says this: scientists and humanists should consider together the possibility that the time has come for ethics to be removed temporarily from the hands of philosophers and biologicized. Even the computer questioned my use of the word. Biologicized there, taken away to biology to somehow explain it biologically. There are so many questions that come when you do this and move towards evolutionary ethics. Unfortunately, time flees so quickly in this. So let me raise just one question. How do they explain what is known in the world of ethics as supererogatory acts, acts of great nobility? Some years ago, an Amtrak train plunged into some swirling, deadly waters because a bridge collapsed underneath them. Tremendous stories came out of that of human heroism. Probably the best was Gary and Mary Jean Chauncey's story. Struggling to stay alive, their primary concern was to thrust their 11-year-old daughter, Andrea, who was stricken with cerebral palsy and bound to a wheelchair. How they thrust her into the arms of rescuers, paying in the process with their own lives, but their goal was to get her to safety. How does evolutionary ethics explain this? For evolutionary ethics' entire schema says that first comes self-preservation, then progeny preservation, then lateral relative preservation, and then social altruism. You scratch my back and I'll scratch your back. But the bottom of it all is the protection of the strength that you can give, the strongest that you are. And here are parents protecting one so dependent, so fragile, so needy, so weak. Daniel Goleman, in his book, Emotional Intelligence, begins his book with this to tell us it's about time we began to evaluate more how our ethics are tied into our very emotional makeup. Door number 2, we can't be good without God. Numerous unanswered questions, that's just one of them. But here the divide widens. Not only is there no explanation for such noble deeds, but the converse is even more scary. If man is done nothing but, where will that lead us? Viktor Frankl said this: if we present man as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and environment, we will then feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced, says Frankl, that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some Ministry of Defense or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Strong words as the gap widens if we are nothing but. Door number 2 presents a challenge to be used as an exit. Door number 3, if God is all-powerful, why could he not have always made us to choose good, is what the challenge comes. Here, I think it is important, we may get more time to discuss this, but very simply a statement can be made that will lead me into my Christian response. Somewhere, somehow, fallaciously, the skeptic has assumed that omnipotence means God can do anything. No, if God can do anything, the question would dissolve, wouldn't it? If God could make something mutually exclusive, then he can be loving and evil at the same time. You cannot put that which is mutually exclusive and say, why can't God do that? When you talk about intrinsic freedom, can you really talk about a freedom that is so engineered and reined in? I find this rather ironic coming from the skeptics, because the same skeptic arguing for the age of the universe and rightly arguing for it in its billions of years and all of that, they make this comment: how can it be much younger than that? Why would God deceive us by giving us units of measurement that are not really representing what actually is? That would be a deceptive way, wouldn't it? But when they put their ethical hats on, they then want a freedom that is not actual. That there can be a deception to that freedom, that we can be free but always choose good at the same time. Alvin Plantinga has responded to this very convincingly in his response to J.L. Mackie and Anthony Flew. But what then of the Christian worldview? How does this really play out as God reveals himself here? Very quickly. First, God is the author of life. And in that authorship, God reveals himself not only as good, but as holy. It is important to bear this in mind. Not only good, but God is holy, meaning separate. Life is then intrinsically sacred. not a conferred sanctity by society, not a pragmatic sanctity that allows us to keep from eating each other up. This is an intrinsic sanctity, which means my race, my humanity, my sexuality are sacred gifts given by God to me as I have been fashioned in His image. Modern day artists reverse those very things, and that's why violence and sensuality become the occupation of so many in their entertainment. God made life sacred, sexuality sacred. Life is intrinsically sacred. Secondly, and quickly, if God is the author, then there is a script. There is a storyline. The storyline tells us what life is all about and meant to be. If you remember, any one of you have seen the play Phantom of the Opera. There used to be times I'd be driving in my car listening to some of its music. Some of it was jarring. Some of it was sort of almost discordant until I saw the play. Once you saw the play and knew the story, you knew how the music fit in very well. If God is the author, there is a storyline. If there is no storyline, the logical consequences are horrendous impossibilities. Steve Turner, the English journalist, says, if chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. I remember going to hear Stephen Hawking at Cambridge University. And as you know, he speaks through his speech synthesizer. His question was, is man determined or free? A marvelous lecture, at the end of which he says this, we do not know if man, he says this, yes, man is determined. But since we do not know what is determined, he may as well not be. There was silence in the auditorium. There is a storyline, but we don't know it. There is a determinism here, the stranglehold of determinism. But since we don't know what it is, we may as well not be. Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard repeatedly says, there is no higher purpose, there is no higher meaning. For the Christian, number one, God is the author, life is sacred. Number two, there is a storyline. Number three, and quickly, if there is a story, what is the response? The response is that of worship. Worship is the first solitary response. That's why the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. Why is that? Because all that you see diversity in diversity outside is only representing what is going on the inside. The life on the inside needs to be harnessed first. And worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It's the quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. That was given by Archbishop William Temple years ago. You see, the goal and the process of life's script is not just to do good deeds. It is the sanctity of the inner life, the binding together of all of my propensities. And when that is bound together, worship can be expressed not only at a church altar. Worship can be expressed in the place of work where you are involved and employed. Wasn't it not Eric Liddell in the film Chariots of Fire who said, God has made me for a purpose for China, but He's also made me fast, and when I run, I feel His pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposite of sacred in that sense is not secular. The opposite of sacred is profane, and profanity is where evil finds its ultimate expression. So worship is the first response, and out of worship comes love. And if love is the legitimate response of a free heart, love can never be coerced. It is the supreme ethic, worship of God, and love of your fellow human beings. Even Jean-Paul Sartre granted this. The man who wants to be loved does not desire the enslavement of the beloved. He is not bent on becoming the object of passion which flows forth mechanically. He does not want to possess an automaton. And if we want to humiliate him, we need only try to persuade him that the beloved's passion is the result of a psychological determinism. The lover will then feel that both his love and his being are cheapened. If the beloved is transformed into an automaton, the lover finds himself alone. And by the way, even Bertrand Russell granted in his letters that love was the one thing he never fully experienced. So worship is the legitimate response out of which love flows. But then comes the heart of this issue. And I want you to give me your undivided attention here, because as theologically rich as it sounds, some of the greatest thinkers in the world have said this to them has been the most meaningful aspect of the Christian faith. This brings us to the core of the matter. How is such love possible? Here, suffering enters center stage. The essence of the Christian message is found in the cross. It is not something Jesus wanted, but something for which, the very purpose for which he came. Let me read a paragraph I've penned on this. As the cross drew nearer and the shudder was felt, he struggled only to say, for this very cause did I come into this world. With double force he embodied the destructiveness of evil and its cost by showing what humanity can descend to when God is rejected. God allowed the one whose life was lived perfectly to suffer not by his own instigation, but by ours. Human will gone wrong academically raises the question of innocence and suffering. But in actuality, by exalting itself over God, it in fact instigates it and justifies it. In the greatest trial of all time in history, before a human jury, a crescendo of voices called for the release of a criminal and sending the innocent one to be crucified. Even Mahatma Gandhi, a devout Hindu, said that he found the cross of Christ to be the most overwhelming aspect of the Christian faith and singularly unique. Martin Luther King himself voiced the same. Here we get to the crux of suffering and the Christian answer. I believe the more we understand this, whatever else we may conclude, we will have to grant its uniqueness. Let me try and illustrate this for you. Elie Wiesel, when he was in Auschwitz, along with some of his other cellmates, was called out to witness the hanging of 3 Jewish men. 2 of them were older, 1 was a young man. And Elie Wiesel said it was a horrible, difficult thing to go through. The first 2 of them died rather instantly, no resistance. The young man struggled and kicked in the gallows, and as he was hovering in the throes of death, Wiesel says, I heard a man standing behind me muttering, God, where are you? Where is God in all of this? Where are you, God? And he says, seemingly out of nowhere, there welled up within me the same question, where is God? Where is he? He says, equally out of nowhere, the voice emerged from within me as if saying, I said to myself, hearing God saying this, right there hanging on the gallows, where else? Right there hanging on the gallows, where else? Now, I want to ask you this question. Why did Wiesel even ask the question, where is God? Where are you? May I suggest something? What Alvin Plantinga said, heinous evil is unexplainable for the skeptic. What is genuinely appalling is not just suffering as much as crass human wickedness. But can there be any such thing as horrifying wickedness if naturalism were true? I don't see how. There can be such a thing only if there is a rational way creatures are supposed to live, obliged to live, and the force of that normativity is such that appalling and horrifying nature of genuine wickedness is its inverse. Naturalism can perhaps handle foolishness and irrationality, acting contrary to what are your own interests. It can't accommodate appalling wickedness. Listen to these words of a rock group singing some years ago. She begged me not to kill her. I gave her a rose, then slit her throat, watched her shake till her eyes closed, had sex with a corpse before I left her, and drew my name on the wall like helter-skelter. That's appalling wickedness. I've seen it in the days I was in Vietnam, in the days in Cambodia, in the days in Beirut. I have seen savagery of horrible kinds, heinous wickedness. And may I suggest to you, the list is long of men and women who left the avenues of skepticism because they could not explain this kind of wickedness rationally, and just as that's the way it is, we dance to the DNA. W.H. Auden is one of them. Professor Eleanor Stump, professor of philosophy at the University of St. Louis, has written a profound essay on the mirror of evil, where she talks how in the middle of horrible evil, she suddenly saw the rays of goodness and felt tears running down the face, trying to explain those tears. How do you explain it? She says the constancy of evil coarsens the response till suddenly a trace of goodness penetrates that coarseness, and you follow that trail where it is going to lead. And she says, and it led me then to Christ and to his cross. I say it to you again, that the reason he asked the question is there is no explanation for such horrific wickedness unless you can claim moral responsibility and an objective, inherently good standard by which we must judge ourselves. Malcolm Muggeridge, the English journalist, said this: contrary to what might be expected, I look back on experiences that at the time seemed especially desolating and painful with particular satisfaction. But he goes on to say how in all of his sufferings he has come to a great truth, that the cross signifies. It is the cross more than anything else that has called me inexorably to Christ. Number 5, the first dramatic shift then has to take place. Evil is not a problem around there. Evil is a problem within. If you want to pause long enough to raise the question of evil around in this world, you would do well, ladies and gentlemen, to first try and find an answer to the evil within. That's where the problem begins. And when it's multiplied manifold, you see its effect. And sixthly and finally, there is a final reason that I believe a paradigm shift is needed. Meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain, but meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. Meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain, but from being weary of pleasure. The 3 doors that the skeptic tries to escape through, the evidential problem, ends up being swallowed up by the problem when no objective moral good is affirmed. Try to come out with an evolutionary ethical system. Numerous factors are unexplainable. And thirdly, the question, why did not God create us to make us choose good? When love and worship are the central features, choice is inherent. Let me summarize them. Number 1, God is the author of life. Life is sacred. Number 2, there is a script and a transcendent purpose to life. Number 3, that purpose is in the response to the sacred. Worship, the outflow of which is love. Number 4, but how does one do this when evil itself seems so intrusive? The cross redefines the reality of evil and shows God right in the middle of our need. Number 5, the problem of evil and suffering is internal before it is external. Death to self sprouts life in uniqueness. Finally, it is not weariness of pain that brings meaninglessness, but weariness with pleasure, and worship alone is the perpetual novelty. Yes, the songwriter raises the question, why do we never get an answer when we're knocking on the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking on the door? Thankfully, ladies and gentlemen, even the artist knew how to go beyond just the question, and this is the way the song ends. I'm looking for someone to change my life. I'm looking for a miracle in my life. I believe they would have found that answer in Jesus Christ. So I present this paper to you. I want you to know it is not easy, because there are challenges, immense challenges. And I want you to know that as tough as it is, I am utterly convinced that outside of the Christian answer on the cross of Christ, there is no answer. In fact, I'm not even sure how the question is ultimately going to be justified. But I think it's wonderful that in an occasion like this at the Faith and Science Lecture Forum, we can interact with those who will strongly disagree with us. And my hope is that somehow in this interaction, we'll be able to see either the strength or the weakness of various arguments and various issues. It was on this issue one day, sitting high atop a huge building in Dallas, Texas, where a businessman kept raising the question of evil and evil and evil and evil, and he kept raising it repeatedly. And finally, the man sitting next to me watching us interact on this for hour after hour after hour, he looked at this businessman and said to him, I appreciate the fact that you're very, very concerned about the evil that you have seen around you. Can you help me to know you a little better so that I can hear you say what you have done about the evil that you have seen inside you? And there was pin drop silence. The answer is both external and internal. I've gone at high speed because I want to get a lot of this out here. We look forward to the discussion. Thank you for listening. I hope it's not been a drink from a fire hydrant. Take care.
Mr. Anderson received his Master's of Science from Yale University, a Master's in Government from Georgetown University. He has authored over 12 books, including his most recent one, Moral Dilemmas, and he has participated as a moderator in numerous radio and television forums. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Kirby Anderson.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you for being a part of this Science and Faith Lecture Forum. I think that Ravi Zacharias has begun us in a very good way in terms of looking at this very important issue, given us many provocative things to consider and to discuss. For the next 2 hours, we are going to be carrying on a discussion and a debate, and you will be able to participate in it as well. But first, we will be hearing from our panelists, who I'll introduce in just a minute, who will present various worldviews and try to answer this very provocative question of evil and suffering from their particular worldview. Then the other panelists will engage in a discussion and debate. That will take place for the next hour. The following hour, we will be taking questions from the audience as well as from the internet. And so you will be thinking ahead of time about questions that you would want to direct to one of the panelists or to Ravi Zacharias. And we will tell you more about that in just a few minutes. But first of all, let me represent the panel as best as I can. Representing an Eastern worldview will be Dr. Jitendra Mohanty. Dr. Mohanty is Professor of Philosophy and Asian Studies at Emory University and also Professor of Philosophy at Temple University. He earned a BA and MA degree from the University of Calcutta and earned his doctoral degree in philosophy from the University of Göttingen and later was conferred an honorary doctorate from the University of Calcutta. Representing a naturalist worldview will be Dr. Bernard Leikind. He is a plasma physicist, familiar to skeptics for his pioneering work in explaining the physics of firewalking, as well as personal participation in such. He has lectured at a number of different universities and conducted research at the University of Maryland, UCLA, the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, General Atomics, and he is also a senior editor of Skeptic magazine, the official publication of the Skeptic Society. Representing a Christian worldview will be Dr. William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig has received master's degrees from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, a PhD from the University of Birmingham, and a Doctor of Theology from the University of Munich. Each one of them will be given an opportunity to present their particular worldview, to ask some questions, and that will then be followed up by other members of the panelists. Beginning this discussion will be Dr. Mohanty.
Thank you very much. There are lectures where you can follow up by asking questions. I think Dr. Zacharias' lecture was not one of those. It inspired us, it inspired me, and instead of asking questions, I will present to him certain statements to which, if he likes, he can respond. We philosophers are notorious for being trained to ask questions and never to answer them. I do not want to play that role. I agree with him that the exact problem of evil, pain and suffering, which arises when within a monotheistic religion, does not arise outside of those religious worldviews. I agree that reductive naturalism cannot raise that problem and doubt if it can formulate any other problem of evil. My belief is that no religion, not to speak of the monotheistic religions, can satisfactorily solve the problem which they have raised. But I recognize that they have sought to find solutions with the most subtle intellectual means. Even if they can solve the general problem of the presence of evil and suffering, they cannot, so I think, have a good explanation, why is it that I suffer? Why me? No general explanatory principle, whether of science or of theology, can satisfactorily answer the question, why me? The kind of question which we often ask. What I'm emphasizing is the unique singularity of existential subjectivity, which cannot be squeezed into a law-like account. Some of the pain and suffering to be found in the world can be naturalistically, historically, and socially accounted for, and can be prevented by taking appropriate measures. But there still remain a remainder of sheer unmerited, unjustified pain. How to account for it? This pain cannot be reduced to moral evil. Gandhi once said that the Bihar earthquake was God's punishment for the sin of untouchability. The poet Tagore protested. Gandhi reaffirmed that this was unquestionably obvious to him. Not so to me. Faith may help you to come to terms with pain and suffering. That is, however, quite different from understanding it. To say that we cannot understand the ways of providence is to concede a failure to explain and understand. To make pain bearable by faith is quite different from finding an explanation or an answer to the question why. I am not raising the question from the perspective of naturalism, but from the perspective of a religious worldview which is atheistic in the strict sense. The essence of this worldview is the recognition that all nature and living beings are sacred. Sacredness is an ultimate, further irreducible property of living beings. Religion is, to use Whitehead's phrase, world loyalty, reverence for life. But pain and suffering cannot be sacred. They are not also profane things to be overlooked or simply consumed or passed by. They challenge the sacredness of my singular subjectivity. Existentially, what is needed is not explanation, but coming to terms. And that an individual can, irrespective of religion, he need not understand. But how can I come to terms with the other's unmerited pain? A little innocent infant, for example, in a situation, accidental fire, where no moral evil is responsible. All religions fail. The little one at the moment of pain could not. We use our rhetoric to console ourselves and to facilitate our grieving. The other gradually recedes from our view. Which religion can make sense of the Holocaust? Not the aspect of it as moral evil. Classical theologies bring in freedom of will, a great gift of God with its burden of possible choice of evil. I am thinking of the aspect of sheer pain and suffering, unmerited and unjustified. If I refer to the Hindu gods, I cast doubt whether Vishnu was wrapped in his endless sleep. Did Shiva had not begun his dance of destruction, or had he? Which god helplessly bore a sleepless night for the victims of the gas chamber? It is we who try to make sense of it all. For the gods, perhaps, there was already some sense which you do not grasp, and certainly no sense for the victims. Thank you.
Let me now go to the panel. I think, first of all, Dr. Mohanty has raised questions about unjust pain and suffering and evil. Ravi Zacharias, let me go to you maybe for any comments and see other comments that we might have from the panelists.
Appreciate what you've said. My microphone on? Yes. I'm not sure where to enter into the discussion, Dr. Mohanty, but when you describe yourself, say, as an atheistic, as that of an atheistic religion, and in your writings you sort of try to bring in a blend between Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. But they are quite different, very different, in fact. And your comment that it is distinctively a theistic problem and not endemic to the situation that you would face, say, in the Hindu philosophy or the Buddhist philosophy. Is that really a fair representation of the situation when, like, for example, one of your own books is entitled, Relativism, Suffering, and the Beyond. So obviously it is a problem that you have to deal with even in Hinduism. The whole idea of karma and reincarnation is that. So it is part of the problem for those philosophies too, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what I wanted to say is that I agreed with you that there is no problem of evil in naturalistic philosophies. And the problem arises only within the religious traditions. Now, the religious traditions may be either theistic, and we know the whole long tradition of Christian theology is trying to deal with this problem with a great deal of intellectual subtlety. But there is also the long tradition of the Hindu and the Buddhistic religions trying to deal with this problem. Hinduism wavers between a kind of theism, a provisional theism, and a large pantheism, right, to which I owe perhaps my belief in the sacredness of all things, right, without removing the source of the sacredness to a transcendent being. Nature, living beings are sacred. And within that worldview, I find the beginnings also of the problem of suffering, because in some way, unmerited pain and suffering cannot simply be taken as sacred, and yet not also as profane. They have an ambiguous position between profanity and sacredness, and that's what I wanted to draw attention to, not solve any problem. Mm-hmm. But the problem does arise as soon as you believe in the sacredness of all living beings.
Don't you think the problem arises even when you don't believe in the sacredness, and that's why some irreligious people start looking to religion for answers?
Oh, yeah, they might. They might. The problem is, you see, the answer to the questions are extremely relative to what is your criterion of a good answer. Now, one criterion of a good answer is that it makes you come to terms with those things. And that I concede. Any religious faith can help you to cultivate an attitude in which you come to terms with your pain and suffering. But to say that because I can come to terms with pain and suffering in my own subjective life, to say that I have an answer to the question is a very different thing. It depends on how strong your concept of a good answer is. I think my concept of a good answer is very strong, and I don't find answers, but I find them very useful means of reconciling, of not understanding, but bearing, grieving, pain and suffering. And for some people, that's all the answer you need.
Well, I'd like the others to enter in. I just want to add one qualifier. I think in the Christian worldview, it is not a pragmatic thing that makes you feel better. From the Christian perspective, it makes you feel better because it will make you feel better, but that's not the reason you go to it. You go to find out the truth. And if it is true, it will also provide an answer. But I'll let someone else add something.
Dr. Craig.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here. With respect to the problem of evil, it occurs to me, and I'd like to get your reaction to this, that this problem, however powerful and difficult it is for theistic faiths, monotheistic faiths, strikes me as an even greater difficulty for pantheistic religions. Right. And the reason I think it is this, and I'd like your reaction. At least in theism, there is a distinction between the creator and the creation. And that even though evil permeates and infects the creation, at least it doesn't infect the being of God, because God transcends the creation. So that God is holy, absolutely good, the source of all value and love, even though the creation may be fallen and infected with evil. But on a pantheistic worldview, there is no distinction between creator and creation. Rather, all is one. All is in one undifferentiated absolute, in which case evil is brought into the very being of God himself or itself. And therefore, it seems to me that pantheism is even deeper trouble than monotheism is, because it can't make the distinction between creation and creator, and so evil ultimately infects God himself, unless we're forced to say then that evil is merely illusory.
Well, as a matter of fact, the strictly pantheistic elements of Hindu philosophy do not have a notion of creation, do not have a concept of creation. It is very much like Spinoza's,
Right.
that there is no concept of creation. There is a concept of the immanence of God in the world, or we call it God. I do not want to call it God. But as a matter of fact, the great Hindu philosopher Shankara virtually said, coming from your state in Kerala, that God is the way the ignorant person sees Brahman to be. That means it is equally a product of ignorance, the idea. One knows the metaphysical truth, knows the unity of all beings, but he doesn't need the concept of God. The Hindu philosophies and the Buddhist philosophies had a solution. Now, I'm not going to say that is a good solution or the best solution, because I don't think in these matters there is any solution. That solution is going back on the ideas of rebirth and karma. That means the suffering is due to rebirth, your karma, and there is a process through which you gradually improve your state of affairs of the soul. So you are responsible for it. I am responsible for my suffering. So there is an explanation. Now, whether the explanation is good or bad, I'm not going to argue for the present, actually. That is really a kind of causal explanation that it is due to my past life. And it's an explanation which is is double-edged. Looked from one side, it is deterministic, that my past determines my future. Looked at from another point of view, it is futuristic. That means my present actions determine my future. So the way you look at it. Now, if you noted my emphasis in this presentation, the emphasis on the unique singularity of the subjective being, the point that I was trying to make is no causal explanation in terms of a law-like statement can be a good explanation of it. That was what I was putting the emphasis on. That means to the question, the moment I discover that I have a terminal illness which is going to be painful, my natural response, why me, is a question to which no scientific law-like generalization, that given these conditions one has this terminal illness, is an answer. Because you still would be asking, why am I falling under that law? Why am I one of the statistical cases of that law and not someone else? In other words, here is a question which is the crux of the matter, which is so existential that the only thing the individual can learn, and here religion, faith, and many other things really can help him to come to terms, is come to terms. But if we think that we have explained it, we are using the explanation in a very peculiar sense, which has nothing to do with the way we explain phenomena, giving their reasons, making them instances of general principles. I think we use the word explanation in rather an ambiguous term and move very quickly from one to the other, feeling that we have explained a phenomenon. I think that all explanation fails, and I really believe that the person who says we do not understand the ways of providence is much more honest, which is literally saying that we do not understand it.
So you think even the karma solution fails?
I think the karma solution also fails.
Because
it is also trying to give a law-like statement.
And isn't the karma solution sort of like writing one check to cover another check, and you just keep pushing the problem back and back, but it never really ultimately gets solved?
No, it's also pushing forward and forward. So there is no, the problem is very different.
The problem is not so much pushing it forward, the problem is pushing it backward.
No, it's both ways, actually.
You know, because when Dr. Craig raised the question that in pantheism there is no distinction, I'm assuming you are then with the Advaita, the non-duality way of thinking that the ultimate reality is one. If the ultimate reality is one and the ultimate reality is Brahman, where did this evil and wickedness come from?
Well, of course, you see, as you certainly are pretty well aware, that even this Vedantic thesis of the ultimate oneness of all being went through many, many different formulations to the extent to which they were able to admit differences within the oneness, and to the extent the differences were regarded to be mere unreal phenomena. So they were it is not a very simple solution, which is enormously complex. And I know also that in Christian theology also the idea of God has gone through many, many different accounts. So what I was going to say is that there is an aspect of evil, moral evil, of which Christian theology, to my mind, has given a good solution, a good explanation to understand moral evil, tying it with freedom of will and tying that with God's great gift. But there is an aspect of evil which is irreducible to moral evil, and that's where my main problem, as I presented. As I said, I don't want to get into the problem of moral evil. And that aspect of evil is what I think remains always recalcitrant to all law-like explanations.
Let's move on to our next worldview. We're going to now hear from Dr. Bernard Leikind, representing a naturalist worldview.
If God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly benevolent, how can he allow evil and suffering to exist? Scholars know this question by the four-syllable name theodicy. The ancient Hebrews, those who wrote the Hebrew Bible, and those who wrote the Gospels, could see perfectly well that whatever God's purposes, they don't include ensuring justice in this life. Those who think as I do would say that the existence of senseless evil, suffering, show that the supposed properties of God, omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness cannot exist without contradiction. Now, tonight, I'm only a physicist in a nest of theologians and philosophers. As you could tell, my worldview gave me the black hat, but I'm going to do my best. In life, in your life, it is rare that you can answer the question of why bad things happen to you or why evil exists. But in literature, it's possible to know the answer. I take as my text for this evening the Hebrew Bible's book of Job. In this great literary work, we know the answer. God has proposed Job to the Satan as a model human. Have you considered my servant Job? You will find no one like him on earth, a man of blameless and upright life, who fears God and sets his face against wrongdoing. The Satan needles God. Has not Job good reason to be God-fearing? Have you not hedged him round on every side with your protection, him and his family and all his possessions? Whatever he does, you have blessed, and his herds have increased beyond measure. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and then he will curse you to his face. Evidently, God is a gambling man and agrees to this vicious test that Satan has proposed. If Job responds to the torments that Satan has in mind by cursing God, Satan wins. If Job does not, God wins. Now, I wondered why anyone would take a bet against someone who is omniscient, but I'll leave that aside. With God's permission, the Satan arranges for all of Job's oxen and asses to be stolen and for the herdsmen to be killed. Then God's fire burns up Job's sheep and their shepherds. 3 groups of bandits steal Job's camels and kill their drivers. Finally, a whirlwind knocks the eldest son's house onto Job's 7 sons and 3 daughters, killing them. As Job mourns these disasters, he does not curse God. So, with God's permission, the Satan covers Job's body with running sores. Still, Job does not blaspheme, even though his wife encourages him to do so. Now, I'd like to say, by the way, that today, any modern hospital ethics committee or university research committee considering a proposed experiment involving human beings of this nature would absolutely reject it. But no one in ancient times thought to criticize God for allowing this experiment to take place. This is because moral values differ from one time to another, and they change through time. They are neither absolute nor objective. The only moral lawgiver is you and me. All of us together create through our social actions the moral codes by which we strive to live. Although many of our moral thoughts trace their roots to the ideas of these ancient people and earlier, we have learned much since that distant time. Some of their moral ideas were good and others were bad. The biblical text, for example, gives many rules regulating slavery, but so far as I know, does not condemn slavery as wrong. Here are the first 3 verses of Job. There lived in the land of Uz a man of blameless and upright life named Job, who feared God and set his face against wrongdoing. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen and 500 asses, with a large number of slaves. Thus Job was the greatest man in all the East. The fact that Job owned slaves was considered a mark of his virtue and success in life. We, on the other hand, are embarrassed that Thomas Jefferson, the hero who wrote that all men are created equal, the author of our Declaration of Independence, we are embarrassed that he was a slave owner. But no ancient Hebrew was embarrassed that Job was a slave owner. They thought it a sign of God's favor. Of course, we have as much trouble today upholding our values as did our ancestors. But today's standards are higher than they were then. Our values today have advanced and improved. Job's friends, shocked at the terrible events that have afflicted him, tell Job that he and his relatives must have sinned to deserve this punishment. Job confidently tells his friends that he and his family are innocent. His friends try to comfort Job by telling him that God's purposes are hard to understand, but that they must be good. Just as we would, Job finds this explanation hard to accept. Although he asks God for an explanation, Job never criticizes God. God wins the bet. Job is one of world literature's great examples of dramatic irony, the literary device by which the audience knows things that the actors do not. We know that Job's sufferings have nothing to do with great and inscrutable cosmic purposes. We know that Job is innocent. We know that the discussion between Job and his friends is interesting but irrelevant. God has allowed the devastation of Job's life and the slaughter of all those innocent people to settle what is little more than a barroom bet. As God says to the Satan, "You incited me to ruin him without a cause." Is God ashamed by the suffering that he has allowed? Not at all. When he finally appears to Job, does he tell Job the truth? He does not. He could have said to Job, "I'm sorry about the damage and the suffering that I allowed to happen to you, your family, and your servants. It was essential to my plan for the world. There was no other way. Because of your help, all humans now have a shining example of how to bear inevitable, undeserved suffering. Thank you for your help. I'm proud of you. Your name will live forever." This would have been the truth, and Job might even have felt that his suffering had served some purpose. Instead, God evades the issue by bombast and indirection. Setting up a straw man, he asks Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" He incorrectly implies that Job's suffering had some great cosmic purpose too complicated for Job to understand. Job, conceding defeat, says, "But I have spoken of great things which I have not understood, things too wonderful for me to know." Evidently, if God is in charge of things, we cannot rely upon him to make sure that our lives, sometimes filled with pain and suffering, have meaning. His inscrutable purposes may be far beyond us, or he may be playing with us, or he may be tormenting us. Dr. Zacharias asserts that the Christian God has Christians' welfare in mind, but the evidence of our lives provides little to support this view. I would say that the universe has no purpose. It is absurd to think that a creator assembled this universe so large and so old for some purpose involving us, an insignificant part of this immense universe. All ideas about cosmic purpose that I know about are speculation without credible evidence to support them. When we consider buying a used car, we kick the tires, slam the doors, test drive it, ask an expert mechanic to study the engine, and ask for the repair records. If we can, we investigate the reputation of the seller. Since all human knowledge is imperfect, we may still make a mistake. We would not take the manufacturer's or the salesman's word on faith. Reason, observation, and experiment, limited as they are our best methods for approaching the truth about any subject, not revelation. Why would we apply different and frequently discredited methods to the incomparably more important questions of life's meaning? In the words of Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. Here is my answer to Dr. Zacharias' challenge for a naturalist source of meaning. Purpose and meaning are not properties of the universe in the way that mass and energy are properties of the universe. There were no such things as purpose and meaning in the universe so far as we know until our ancestors, emerging onto the African savanna, developed consciousness. Purpose and meaning are our creation, your creation. They are our glory and our tragedy. Even those who attribute the source of our moral ideas to one God or another may agree that these gods' purposes are so distant from our own that it comes to the same thing whether you believe or not. Here is what I believe. Each of us is responsible for the private and the public meanings of our own lives, insofar as we can control our fate and foresee the consequences of our actions. As one of your admirable neighbors, Jimmy Carter, once said, life is unfair.
The question of Job and the meaning and purpose of life. Ravi Zacharias first, and then other panelists.
Who wrote the book of Job?
No one knows who wrote it.
Then how do you know he didn't?
Job?
Yeah.
Job's the subject. There was some poet who wrote, I'll tell you what scholars think. The beginning and end part, which are in prose, are from some ancient story. The central part, the poetry part, was written by some wonderful and great poet. A third person stuck in the fourth person, Elihu. They think the great Job poet didn't write him. And the book itself has been edited by scribes, and there are even parts of the text now which are corrupt, and the wrong person says the wrong lines. That, as far as we know, that's what we know about it.
So if you don't know...
We don't know the author. Anonymous.
What are you critiquing if you don't know what's real and what isn't?
This story is one of the most wonderful, famous books within the most important book in Western civilization. It's there because, according to the religious men who assembled that book, it expressed what to them was a great truth. And no one's. Are you proposing we remove it from the Bible?
No. I'm asking you the question. I don't believe what you do, but you're just telling me scholars think not all of it is actually authentic. Some's been corrupted, some's been edited, some's been added.
All we have is the text before us.
Yeah, but is it an authentic text or an inauthentic text? Because if your critique is valid, you must be critiquing a valid text.
I came here as a physicist and cited things from your book. It's your book.
No, not your version. Not your version. Not your version. Okay, let me ask you a couple more questions on Job.
Did I use the wrong translation?
Your translation says it's corrupt.
I use the New American Bible. It's a modern translation.
I'm not asking what version. I'm talking about the source criticism you've just ascribed to it. Yes. So if it is not an authentic source of what I would see it as truly part of God's Word. But you're saying there's corruption and this and that. But let me ask you the next question.
You mean you think that there are words in the Hebrew and Bible and the Gospels that are inauthentic?
No, you do.
I think it's a work of literature, so to me it's not a problem whether it's authentic or not. It's just a work of literature written by people.
I'll pose a couple of questions, and then I'll let Dr. Craig go to this too. I highly recommend you read it properly. I'll tell you why. Have you read any other reference to Job in the Bible?
Yes, in John he refers to the patience of Job.
No, it's not in John. It's in James.
Well, okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
What's the
I'm
context?
not an expert in this.
What's the context?
I don't know.
I think you should. I'll tell you why.
But he obviously misreads it since Job was not patient.
Well, you know, your criticism was,
Yes.
Dr. Leikind, that he was not affirmed, that he was not lauded for what he went through, that he was not given the accolades, that God should have met with him and applauded him.
Didn't even
and I'd
tell him
like
the
to
truth.
get this off to some more of his fundamental presuppositions later on, but I just want to stay with this for a moment.
God misled Job.
First of all, in the end of the book, his family comes to him and meets with him and say they knew what had happened and that this had come from God. You have taken a kind of genre of literature called wisdom literature, which has a scaffolding of a dramatic, poetic nature. And the one thing Job wanted in that, his entire search, he got. What was it?
He wanted to know why he was suffering.
No, he wanted an audience with God.
Well, he appealed to God to find out why he was suffering.
He wanted an audience with God.
Yes.
And he got it. And he established once and for all that answers in the realm of suffering may not always be immediately and comprehensively explainable, but the relational factor with God exceeded any propositional answer that one could find.
But in this case, I agree with you in the general case. I mean, if someone's wife and family are killed by a drunk driver, well, your answer is correct. But in the case of Job, we absolutely know why Job suffered. And it's because God made this bet. And God didn't tell him. God could have told him, but God misled him.
You're assuming he doesn't know that. There's many times characters in Bibles gave the details and explained the details to writers, even if he didn't write it. But I don't want to dominate the discussion. I see, though Craig's got some questions he'd like to ask too.
I was interested in your comments on slavery being permitted in the Old Testament.
It's
but
regulated.
now, yes, that's right. It was regulated so as to prevent abuse of slaves. There was a Jubilee year where they could be released and so forth. But today we know better, and we abhor slavery today. And you said that it wasn't just that these ancient Hebrews had a different set of moral values than we do, but that we have a better set of moral values than they did. Now, that's an interesting value judgment that you're making. And I'd like to know, on an atheistic, naturalistic worldview, on what basis can you make that value judgment between these two separate societies and cultures?
Why do I think a society is better that doesn't have slaves?
Yes, why is our set of values which abhor slavery superior to any other cultures which adheres to slavery? Why characterize this as a moral improvement rather than just a difference?
Well, it certainly is a difference, and the reason I think it's a moral improvement is that all of us have things to offer, and slavery denies large numbers of people the chance to achieve everything that they have to offer to us. And I happen to think we live in a pluralistic society, and the essence of our society is that everyone gets a chance to contribute. Everyone gets the chance to throw out their ideas.
But that wasn't the essence of ancient Hebrew society, right? I mean,
oh, no.
So why are you imposing our values on them?
Oh, I'm not criticizing them for having slaves. That's their society, and that was where, you know, but the point I'm making is that there's no place where it's written in stone, here are the moral values by which we should all live for all time.
So you can't really condemn slavery on an atheistic, naturalistic worldview, can you?
That's right.
No, I do.
But
I do. I think slavery is wrong. I think it's a bad thing.
But isn't that just an expression of your own socio-cultural situation that you were born in this?
That's right.
So it doesn't have any objective sort of validity.
No, it comes from our society. That's why I said that all of us, I'll give you an example. Today, right today, we are arguing about whether or not it is moral for the president to have lied about his sexual relationship. We're arguing about that. Is that a moral thing or not? We ourselves, all of us today, the senators, all of us who are voters, we are deciding whether what he did was a moral thing or not. And that's the way morals are created.
Dr. Mohanty.
Yeah, it seems to me that your questioning, and also Dr. Zacharias' wonderful argument he gave before, I find there are many missing links. Of course, you could develop your entire argument, just as I cannot develop my entire critique. But I think you passed on very quickly, and also implicit in your question to him, that accepting objective moral values means that you need a source of a lawgiver. I think I am willing, perhaps I differ from the physicist in this regard, I'm willing to accept objective moral values, but I still do not find any compelling argument that if I accept objective moral values, there must be a lawgiver.
But he doesn't even accept objective moral values.
No, I know that. I know that. I know that.
In fact, I would say,
he does not.
And I would say, if you believe that you have some set of objective moral values, I would say, well, why should I believe that you have them? I mean, how are you going to know? Well, you're going to have to do the same thing as anybody else who has relative moral values to try to show why your values are better and right and they work correctly and they have this, all of those things you'll have to go, you can't tell the difference between absolute objective values and relative ones. It's just a fact.
You don't think that you can tell that we ought to love a child rather than torture and sexually abuse a child?
I think that's a good idea, to love a child. I think it's a good idea. It arises from our biological heritage. It's natural and normal for us.
But one isn't morally different from the other?
No, I think it's that they're morally different. It's bad to inflict harm. That's why I criticize God in the book of Job. He has inflicted unmerited, undeserved suffering on totally innocent people.
And you think that's wrong of God?
I think that's wrong of God.
On what basis do you make that value judgment?
I think it's bad to inflict suffering and a harm on other people.
Why?
What do you mean, why? I mean,
why is that wrong on a naturalistic worldview? The Nazis thought it was all right to do that to Jews.
They did, and that's because morals are created by societies. And that society created a system that made those people see with such hatred. And we have many differences in moral opinions. In some Asian societies, such as in China and Japan, they're much more communitarian oriented than we are, and we're very individualistically oriented. Well, I mean, do I think that there's some place where it's written, here it is, you're supposed to be individualistic? I don't think so. Let's take specific example to discuss it. Is divorce moral? Let's ask that. Is divorce moral? In your absolute moral code, is divorce moral?
Well,
I think the issue here is anything, not just divorce, is anything right or wrong? And by your own philosophy, nothing is.
Now, you haven't answered my question.
No. Why divorce?
This is a pretty well-known debating tactic here, and I want to know, is divorce moral? That's the question. I'll answer that one. That's a yes or no question.
Very briefly, the Bible does lay down certain conditions prohibiting divorce and allowing divorce under other conditions. So, I mean, that's just a matter of, you can look in the Gospels and see what Jesus said. But honestly, Dr. Leikind, this isn't a debating tactic or trick. This is a fundamental philosophical question. Right. On the one hand, you want to make value judgments like God was wrong to do this to Job. Right. Slavery was abhorrent. We have improved morally over this other culture. Right. The Nazis were wrong. Right. And yet on the other hand, out of the other side of your mouth, you're affirming moral relativism. You have no transcendent anchor for these values, and hence you're lost in a sea of sociocultural relativism.
You were correct in everything you said till you said I was lost.
All right.
That's why we invited you here.
Dr. Leikind, we'll give you the last comment here, and then we're going to move on.
We here today are the children of the intellectual children of the ancient Greeks and the modern Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and the new ideas of democratic thought. all of us here, American citizens, and these things, including our religious values, form what today we think are a proper moral code. And if we were brought up somewhere else, if we were brought up in Japan or India or somewhere else, we would have different views as to what was proper moral behavior. And that's why you and I both agree that it's wrong to torment your children.
Representing now the Christian worldview, Dr. William Lane Craig.
Now, as I understood my role this evening, it was to pose a question to our featured speaker tonight rather than present my own views, and so that's what I've prepared. Ravi, as I listened to your paper, it seemed to me that you launch a two-pronged attack on the problem of evil. Negatively, you show the inadequacy of the atheistic account of evil. Positively, you lay out a Christian perspective on suffering. Now, I'd like to focus on your negative critique of the atheistic account. You present the following argument in 3 steps. Step 1, objective moral values exist only if God exists. Step 2, objective moral values do exist. 3, therefore, God exists. Now, this is a logically valid argument, as you point out, and therefore the atheist's only recourse is to deny that one of the premises is true. But you ask, which one will he deny? I think this is certainly the right question to ask, and I want to press it further because I think that you somewhat let the atheist off the hook in your lecture. You surmise that the atheist will try to deny premise 1, that objective moral values exist only if God exists, and he'll try to deny this by appealing to evolutionary ethics. He will hold that we have evolved moral values in the struggle for survival. And your response to this is that sociobiological attempts to explain morality are implausible in light of people whose lives are lived in self-sacrifice and service to others. Sociobiology can't make sense, for example, of a Mother Teresa. On their view, she turns out to be a sort of evolutionary mutant, a sort of genetic defect. Now, I think that you're right about the implausibility of such sociobiological accounts of ethics, but the problem, I think, goes much deeper. What does it mean to say that moral values are objective? It means, I believe, to say that they are valid independently of whether anybody believes in them or not. It's to say, for example, that the Holocaust was wrong, even though the Nazis thought it was right. And it would still have been wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in exterminating or brainwashing everybody who disagreed with them. But then it's evident, I think, and our conversations with Dr. Leikind bear this out, I think, that proponents of evolutionary ethics don't affirm the objectivity of moral values in that sense. For on their view, moral values are simply biologically determined traits which have evolved because of their survival value and utility. If the initial conditions had been different, then a quite different set of traits might have evolved. And then we would have a different morality. For this reason, intelligent life, which evolved on another planet, might find no reason at all to regard human beings as morally valuable or endowed with human rights or inherent dignity. Human rights would be a delusion of grandeur on the part of these hairless apes. And thus, evolutionary accounts of ethics actually go to support rather than to refute your first premise, namely that objective moral values exist only if God exists. They show that in the absence of God, there just are no objective moral values. Well, now, it might be said then that evolutionary ethics serve to undermine your second premise, that objective moral values do exist. But then what I want to know is, how can the atheist press the problem of evil if there is no objective wrong? By asserting that evil exists, doesn't the atheist acknowledge that objective moral values exist? For some things are evil. So isn't it the case that wholly apart from the success or failure of evolutionary ethics in explaining the lives of people who live noble and sacrificial lives, the even deeper deficiency in such a view is that such a position only strengthens the force of your argument by underscoring the fact that in the absence of God, objective moral values simply do not exist.
We will now hear from, again, our panelists on this issue of evolutionary ethics. I am sure that Dr. Leikind has something to say. First of all, Ravi Zacharias, do you have a comment at all?
Bill Craig's absolutely right. And I was hoping, of course, that in my door number 1, Bill, where we were talking, where I moved them from the argument of J.L. Mackie, who ultimately ended up, with the subjective side of it, and then taking him through Richard Dawkins, where he denied that even there is such a thing as evil. And in his Selfish Gene tried to, which I've always said would have been better titled The Selfish Genius rather than The Selfish Gene, and taking them ultimately through Hobart Maurer's quote that they have lost their very sense of essential value and worth. You're right, the argument has to be pushed further. I've pushed it further in my writings, never had anybody really counter it, and basically what you get is this kind of self-contradiction, that objective moral values don't exist, but we are better than they were 2,000 years ago. And while there is no absolute moral right or wrong, I do think it is a good thing not to torture babies. I mean, this kind of some smuggling in objective moral values while denying a point of measurement. And maybe this is where the interaction with Dr. Mohanty is really valid and to the point. Why God, if you do grant that objective moral values exist?
My position is obviously a little different from Professor Leikind's. I believe in objective moral values. I consider moral relativism to be mistaken. I believe in objective property of beauty in things which are beautiful. I believe in objective property of sacredness in living beings. But from accepting objective moral values, the argument to God seems to me still require many missing links which have not been provided. You both have been critiquing a very weak theory, namely an evolutionary naturalistic theory of moral values. And I didn't even think it's worthwhile to devote so much of time to that. I think that is a sign of the way modern biology and science has been influencing our thinking, that we think that to be the greatest problem. Objective moral values for me is almost a given datum in our moral experience. I don't have to go to science to confirm or disconfirm it. Just as objective beauty is an experience, is a datum of my aesthetic experience. Objective sacredness of living beings is a datum in my religious experience. But to find a source for it as an explanation, firstly for me is uncalled for, because even if you posit a source, I can still ask, what explains the sacredness of the source? What explains the morality of the source? You will say, because he is a moral being. But that is only begging the issue already. I would accept objective moral values. G. Moore did that. Goodness is a non-natural objective property of things. Objective beauty, objective moral values were accepted by Kant, but did not use gods as the source of the moral values. So it is not obvious to me that accepting objective moral values means that you are committed to a source of the moral values, a lawgiver. As a matter of fact, Kant would have regarded that as a heteronomy of reason and incompatible with the fundamental moral experience that I am autonomous, that someone else gave the law. So I would put it this way. Let us not be concerned with evolutionary biology. There are lots of different sciences. There is physics. There are all the other sciences. Not that the relativism about moral values is old. It goes back to the Greek times already. And it has been considered by the whole history of thought. And I think the objectivity is a very plausible, satisfactory philosophical position for which one can argue. But I do not see that accepting that commits me to a source of the moral values. The moral values are there, actually, in the world, just as aesthetic values are there in the world. Sanctity of living beings is there in the world. What more do I explain by tracing them back to a source? Because you still have to ask the question about that source. Where from does it derive its morality, perfection, sanctity, and beauty? And again, pushing back in an infinite regress. Let us accept the values that we find in the world, amongst us, in our experience, objectively compelling us to recognize them. I am actually compelled to recognize that Holocaust is wrong, doesn't matter whether the Nazis believe in it or who else believed in it. I am compelled to recognize that Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is beautiful. It moves me as something which is independent of me, compelling me to recognize it. That's objectivity, and that's enough for me. It gives me a good worldview to live with.
Dr. Craig?
I think it's important to see, Dr. Mohanty, that this kind of position, I think, sits very uncomfortably, however, with a pantheistic worldview.
Don't commit me to a pantheistic worldview.
Right.
I'm not defending any worldview, actually.
Okay,
Excepting I'm defending a worldview in which there are objective values.
Yes, okay.
The world is not a world merely of material objects, but objective values.
Right. I just wanted to make the point that that kind of a position doesn't sit well with a pantheistic worldview in which all is one and all distinctions are broken down, because you are now affirming an objective moral distinction between good and evil, beauty and ugliness. Now, the question, therefore, is, should we adopt a theistic worldview or just a sort of view of these moral values as existing in a sort of Platonic way?
In the world.
Yeah, all right.
Aristotelian way, not Platonic way. In the world, in rebus.
Okay.
Not anti-res.
Yes. Well, now, I would give a couple of arguments, I think, as to why I think theism is a better view than that. One reason, I think, would be that the nature of moral obligation, of moral duty, that we ought to do certain things, we ought not to do other things, implies a divine command. Because otherwise, you may have that certain things are good and evil, but you don't have this oughtness. Oughtness or duty implies a person to whom the duty is owed.
Well,
and so I think that...
Well, that's an argument long since refuted by Kant and Fichte.
Oh,
Fichte
I
actually
think
argued that saying that ought requires a command by a lawgiver who the sanction is for him was real atheism. That means it takes away the real autonomy of the moral ought.
I think it's very difficult to see.
So I don't want to go back to revive an old argument, which I think to me has been very satisfactorily dealt with.
Okay, I guess we disagree
by the
with that.
greatest philosopher of ought, that is
Pardon
Kant.
me?
The greatest philosopher of the notion of ought is Kant.
Kant was a churchman.
Yeah, I know he believed in God, but did not use it.
No, he didn't use it, but he said it was as certain, the moral law within, and the moral lawgiver was as certain with him as the starry hosts above.
I know that. Now, since Kant said that believing in the moral law is the true religion, not the source of the law, the Frederick II actually asked him, he respected him, but said, don't publish on religion.
Let me give a second argument for why I think theism is better than moral, this kind of moral realism that you
I call
talk
it
about.
moral realism.
And that would be that it would be a coincidence of extraordinary and improbability and unbelievability to think that if there are these objective moral principles that kind of exist, as you say, that it would be just the kind of beings to whom those principles apply that would have happened to evolve by chance in this universe. It would have been as though the moral realm knew that we were coming, so to speak. And that, to me, calls for a designer, an author of both the moral and the physical realm who designs the world to work in tandem.
It's not that easy.
That just shows that there aren't any objective moral values. Our moral values
Dr.
arose when we
Mohanty trying to
evolved.
convince him.
Yeah, I know.
I think you both should talk.
I like very much when you stated, when you state my views, you do a really good job till the end when you say they're wrong. So, I'd like to since this idea of evolutionary ethics has been brought up, I'd just like to take 2 minutes here and say what they are. All animal societies have behaviors that all those animals engage in. And now it happens that animals, much more the tools of instinct than we are, always do the thing the right way. I mean, lions never eat grass, and deer never go kill a lion. It just doesn't happen. They are compelled to behave in what is for their society a moral way. Now, as animals, as these distant ancestors evolved, sometime about 1 million years ago, more or less, humans appeared. And we, in our society at that time, which were small hunter-gatherer groups of 100 people or 50 people, small numbers like that, we evolved proper behavior that everyone in that particular group thought was the right thing to do. They were, nearly everyone in a little group like that would have been related. They would have thought by blood. We now know it's by genes. So we can understand things like altruism as arising out of protecting part of yourself that's in another person. Now, so we've spent 1 million years living as hunter-gatherers, and we've spent 10,000 years living as advanced civilizations. And we still, the core of our moral thought must come from that 1 million years of living as hunter-gatherer people. But of course, civilization is really different. And sometimes those moral values that we get from these ancient people are good. Sometimes they cause us trouble. And that's why we are trying to improve upon them to give all of us more freedom.
We want to move into
time's running out, so I'll just make one statement. I read your article on ants in Skeptic magazine, and I felt very badly the ants couldn't appreciate it on the moral strength that they teach.
I claim that God created the world for ants and not us.
Yeah, we'll get back to the open question. I think your argument is circular. I just want you to think of that.
I guess we are ready for the question and answer period, so make your way to the front. Are we ready over here? Okay, the question over here.
The question is, if everything originates from God, then what is the source of evil?
I think it'd probably be simpler there.
When you say that everything originates from God, we are talking about God as creator. And when God created and fashioned human beings in his own image, the greatest gift that God gave to us was in the freedom for self-determination, and in the entrustment, and in the creation event. That entrustment was to either trust God for the way the definitions of right and wrong attained, or to become your own definer of right and wrong, and the entailments would follow. So contrary to the pantheistic worldview, which Dr. Craig has pointed out, where there is no distinction between the supreme, impersonal, infinite being, and we are just ultimately either modes of that being or extensions of that being, or don't have the individual identity apart from the ultimate absorption into that being, where evil then becomes part and parcel of the being itself. But in the Christian framework, that is not true. The creation is distinct from the creator, and by the exercise of the will to reject God's claim on good and evil, on right and wrong, if you remember, the line was, did God really say? And in the day that you take of this fruit, as it was said, you shall become as God. So the answer is that the redefining of good and evil by man was the instrumental source of evil.
We have another question over here, and let me just mention that as you go to the microphone and ask your question, we are looking for a question, not a sermon. Question over here.
This is for any or all of the panelists. Professor Douglas Guyvett of Talbot School of Theology made the following argument. Evil is a deviation from the way things ought to be, but there can't be a deviation from the way things ought to be unless there is a way things ought to be. There can't be a way things ought to be unless there is a design plan that says, here's how things ought to be. And there can't be a design plan that says, here's how things ought to be, unless there is a designer which put forth that design plan. So can I get a comment from the panelists on that question, that please?
I think that argument's entirely right, and there is no design plan, and therefore each one of those chains goes back to the beginning. Evil doesn't come from a failure of the design. It is a human decision as to what's evil and what isn't.
Well, that's a very interesting response, because you're agreeing that the argument is valid. You disagree with the first premise. But if one grants that evil is that which ought not to be, then you agree the conclusion would follow. So if we, for those of us who do think that evil is that which ought not to be, that it is a departure from the way things ought to be, you would then say that one ought to conclude to a designer.
Well, what ought to be is only our own opinion.
No, but I mean,
if society create and we decide what ought to be, and I'd like to get down to cases. That's why I asked you about divorce. Now let's consider lies or killing. The Ten Commandments says, "Thou shalt not kill." And so that means that it ought to be there is no killing. But some of us think killing in war is fine. Some of us, that there's justifications for doing it. Some of us think that killing in self-defense is correct. And people argue, is this case justified or is that case justified? So there isn't any kind of absolute standard where you can say, well, just never do this. There's no ought. I think it always ought to be a certain way.
Any other follow-up before we go to another question?
Well, I think that you're making a mistake in ethical theory there. You are extrapolating the absence of a norm because you are saying there are some exceptional situations that come into situations. When a situation itself presents two evil choices, do you therefore say that you can at any time lie and at any time kill? Is that what you're extrapolating?
Oh, no, I think Bill Clinton did a bad thing. I voted for him, but I think he did.
If I could
and
say,
you know what, Dr. Leikind, I agree with you. Go ahead.
It seems to me that to me that this argument, though, that Douglas Guyvet has offered, does speak directly to Dr. Mohanty's question again, too, concerning moral realism, namely that if we think of evil as a departure from the way things ought to be, then that again implies a design plan of the way the universe ought to be. It ought to be a certain way morally, and it's not. And that implies a designer who created this design plan for the moral universe. So this would be another reason, I think, that makes theism a better metaphysical ground for the moral values we both want to affirm.
Well, I still object to the second part of the argument, and the whole idea of design is extremely misleading, because you have in your mind the picture of an architect who draws up a plan. The important thing is the first part of the argument, namely that evil is what goes against what ought to be. That means the distinction between what ought to be and what ought not to be has an objective validity.
Right.
And more than that, our moral experience does not entitle us to say, unless you have a metaphysical propensity to go beyond it and posit a source of all these things. I don't feel that propensity. I am satisfied with the objectivity of the ought and the ought not. Even if the whole world, people lie, everyone lies, still the liar is still under the moral obligation that he ought not to lie. The simple fact that most people lie does not make lie immune from the objective power of the value. That means the power of the ought. That's what my moral experience certifies.
But you see, I appreciate that, Dr. Mohanty, and that's, as you well know, even in your writings, you even have disagreed with some noted Hindu scholars on this very issue. Your article on Rajaram Mohan Roy, you took issue with him on this very matter because he wanted to posit a theistic first cause as a common ground. But maybe they are being more realistic with the inexorable tug to move towards the personal moral being. The very example of why your position cannot be defended objectively is sitting two chairs next to you. Why not his view? Why your view? No, so let me complete it here. So my point is that even Shankara, who was so strongly monistic, found it inescapable to begin his opening line in the commentary by saying the reason he was writing this commentary was to find a way to do away with evil. And in that very critical verse in the Upanishads, where Brahman refers to himself in the first person as wanting to bring creation into being, You know what Shankara did with that. He sort of danced around it and talked about it as an attributeless Brahman talking here to keep his monistic strand alive. But how do you talk about an attributeless Brahman who expresses intention, who expresses a creative desire and a multiplication of entities? So I think your conclusions may be very good that there is a moral objective order. I just don't see how there is a rational way to make it morally obligatory for anyone else.
Well, you see, because we have this picture that something can be morally obligatory to everyone if we have a common lawgiver who is imposing it on us. The bindingness of the moral values comes from the moral experience itself, not from anyone else. Anyone who has felt the moral obligation to help a person who is in need, who has felt the moral repulsion of not keeping one's promise after having made it, is enough evidence for the objectivity of moral values. My problem with the physicist's point of view is not that what he's saying is not scientifically correct. I think it is wrong science to import theology into science. But I am not a scientific realist as I'm a moral realist. I regard scientific theory as a theory which is constructed by the scientific community, and that theory is taken to be true which the community accepts at the moment by its own internal canons.
Let's move on, if we can. Take a question over here for Dr. Leikind.
Yes,
question over here.
My question concerns your issue of evolutionary on the African savanna. I'm a biologist by training, molecular and genetic. I'm curious, you say that a group of people or many group of people came across their moral objectivism or their moral relativism through accidental means. The 50 people or 100 people got together as a band, a familial blood band, and then found laws that worked for them. What, by any evolutionary means, prevents a group of people who haven't discovered those laws coming from wiping those people out? Why were we descended from the ones who found moral truth?
Well, I wouldn't have said accidental as the source of these ancient people's moral values. They arose from even earlier times, so I wouldn't have used the word accidental. And there was nothing to prevent one group of hunter-gatherers from wiping out another group, and it happened all the time. And the societies that happen to exist today are the ones, by definition, that somehow survived, either because they were smarter or they could run faster, or we think that Neanderthals disappeared because somehow our ancestors had certain advantages over them, and they're gone.
A question from the internet right here.
This question is for Dr. Leikind from the University of Kentucky. If morals were developed independently by hunter-gatherer tribes, doesn't the fact that so many morals are the same or similar imply moral objectivity?
No, it implies that humans have common needs and common ways of living. So this is what in evolution would be called evolutionary convergence. Just as dolphins and fish have similar shapes, and birds and bats have similar shapes even though they came from very different places. A society that thought that murdering each other was a fine thing to do would be unlikely to survive. So our moral values come from those things that enabled our ancestors to survive and get their genes into the next generation.
Okay, next question is for the entire panel.
Yes. This is for the whole panel. I'm curious, first of all, for those who hold the evolutionary biology ethic, if you're biological determinists, and if you are, how do you reconcile the words that you used tonight, such as freedom and choose? Dr. Leikind, in fact, I heard you say 3 times already that humans have choice and that we were making these choices. I'd like to know specifically if you're a biological determinist and how you can account for that, and also Dr. Mohanty, you as well.
Some parts of us are biologically determined. I have 5 digits on my hand, absolutely determined by the genes that I have. However, we as humans also have a great deal of freedom, and compared to other animals, seem less ruled by instinct. So to the extent that we have this freedom of behavior, our behavior is not determined. We can decide to run or fight. We can decide how we wish to behave. So we aren't compelled by our genes. Dr. Mohanty?
Well, I'm not a biological determinist. I never said that. As a matter of fact, my relation to science is very different from the scientists, actually. I reject scientific realism, and the success of a scientific theory is its predictive value and not its picture of what reality is like. So I'm a constructivist and a pragmatist with regard to the success of scientific theories and the truth of scientific theories. But with regard to moral values, I'm an objectivist. That means for me, the objectivity of moral values and aesthetic values is much stronger than the objectivity of scientific theories. So I'm not conceding the premises from which you all started when you criticized biological ethics, evolutionary ethics.
And we assume he also believes it's important to report the truths of scientific theory truthfully.
Yes, I think there is an argument against objectivity of values because the values change. We know that there are moral values for the Greeks, which were not exactly the moral values with Christianity. Now, that I easily account for. That means the consciousness of value changes. And many of the values which seemingly were objective were discarded. So the history of mankind establishes certainly a minimal core of moral values pretty well, actually. And I'm willing to go with that, actually.
The next question is for Ravi Zacharias.
Dr. Zacharias, Peter Kreeft, in his book, a professor at Boston University, in his book, The Three Philosophies of Life, he asserts that the greatest tragedy in life is not merely the fact that bad things happen to good people, but that bad things happen to good people as often, if not more than that, happens to bad people. And my question for you is, if God is all-powerful and omnibenevolent and has the power to intervene in certain circumstances or choose not to intervene, then does God just pick and choose which circumstances he will intervene in? And in the circumstances which he does not intervene, why does he make that decision? And also, why does he seemingly not care?
I think Peter Kreeft actually even answers that question in another book of his when he's dealing with making sense out of suffering. I encourage you to read that one too, and his book on Three Philosophies of Life is a superb book. You know, two of the premises that, say, a J.L. Mackie would use in his argument on freedom and God's power. One of the things they assume that, you know, if God is all-powerful, then in his power, he will do everything in his power to stop any evil from happening. And if God is all-loving, a most loving person will do all that he can to keep from any evil happening. So those two premises have to be examined. Point number one, does God's omnipotence really mean that God can do everything? And here the Christian gets very uneasy when you make a statement like this, but you have to be very careful and understand that God cannot do the mutually exclusive. And for God to make us free and yet engineer the freedom and sort of rein in every time we make the wrong choice is to deny the essence of freedom. And now, does a loving person do everything in his power to keep any hurt from coming? If, for example, then in our society, we take a person who has committed a terrible crime and we put them in jail, are we not good people then for bringing about some degree of punishment in society or corrective in society to put them in jail? No. The reason we would justify that is that there is a morally justifiable reason for allowing whatever it is that is allowed, whether it's pain or whether it is hurt. And in the theistic framework, contrary to the religious atheistic and the naturalistic atheistic position, where there's a constant flux of value, there is a standard of value and the privilege of freedom that is given. For God to violate it would be to violate freedom. For God to intervene, though loving, would be to say that there is never a morally justifiable reason to allow pain and suffering. In fact, I am convinced that in the final analysis, when we look at the last moments of our existence, it may just be the reality of an awful lot of suffering and pain, even in physical realities around us, that may enable us to see we are not infinite and completely sovereign over ourselves. So the two premises of God's omnipotence and God's loving goodness both have to be carefully defined in order to understand the question. And by the way, Kraft, I think, does a terrific job of dealing with it himself. Yeah.
Dr. Leikind?
Well, I'd just like to comment that the examples that Dr. Zacharias gives as to what it means that God is omnipotent, they're fine. I don't have any problem with God not being able to do things that are logically impossible, but I have some suggestions. For example, why not just improve things by getting rid of certain diseases? Now, we know that it's not logically impossible to get rid of those. We, through our own efforts, have wiped out smallpox. It's gone. This was one of the greatest scourges of humanity. The fact that we wiped it out shows that it was not a logical impossibility. So this was something that if God was, even within Ravi Zacharias' own definition of omnipotence, God could have done if he wanted to. So he somehow believes that there was some overriding purpose for all the suffering and disfigurement that was suffered by millions of people for centuries. And I just can't understand how you also say that God who did that's benevolent and loving and so on. To me, it's totally internally inconsistent.
Dr. Zacharias?
I'd like Bill to respond to one part of it. I'd like to respond to one. You use the word logical possibility.
You did.
No, you just now did. It's a logical possibility to remove evil. You said that we could do that.
We got rid of smallpox.
Yeah, but you used the term logical possibility.
Right.
I was going to ask you, you said purpose and meaning are not properties of the universe. Do you believe the laws of logic are?
Properties of the universe?
Yeah. I mean, apply to reality?
Logic is also a human creation, and it's a part of mathematics. And in mathematics, we imagine all kinds of things for example, we imagine parallel lines meet. We imagine parallel lines don't meet. All of those things are done in mathematics. Then it's part of physics to see which of these things, what part of logic, what part of mathematics applies to the real world. So mathematicians know of many forms of logic, and it happens that one of them applies to our world as we see it today. So I don't think there's like some objective logic that is a property of the world.
Let's move on. If we do, we have a question, I guess, for Dr. Craig, and I think that may follow up on this one. Next call. Question.
This question is for Dr. Craig and whoever would like to respond, and it's in light of medical genetics. I think one of the responses Dr. Craig said about genetic mutants, about Mother Teresa, about the train wreck. I think Dr. Leikind missed a good ammunition there. But I think there is a purpose in many mutations that we're discovering right now, like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell trait. There's an incredible way just things work out. Now, I'm a physician who have found a home in Reformed faith, so I'll just preset that for you. But just getting out of the debate of the morality here, now genetics research is showing that we have tendency for breast cancer, depression, or maybe even obsessive compulsiveness that we're not lacking here of.
Could you state your question? Could you state your question, please?
The question I'd like to present is, if we're genetically, we have a genetic tendency to certain predispositions and so forth, are we really able to come to a same understanding of morality, perhaps? And this is something that, I guess, unfortunately, in all the medical genetic ethics that we are so involved in, morality is something that's so absent from the discussion because everybody's afraid of touching it.
Okay. Dr. Craig?
If I understand the question correctly, I think that you need to make a distinction between what philosophers call epistemology, which concerns our theory of knowledge, and ontology, which concerns your theory of reality. And the argument that I've been pressing this evening is that evolutionary ethics cannot give you a plausible account of the objective reality of moral values, the ontology of moral values, what Dr. Mohanty is talking about, that these moral values really exist. I don't think naturalism can explain that. But with respect to the epistemological question, as Dr. Mohanty, I think, quite rightly pointed out, it may well be the case that our upbringing, our genes, our sociocultural environment may well determine to a great extent which values we come to appreciate and hold. But that's an epistemological question, you see, not an ontological question. And it's interesting that philosophers have a name for a certain fallacy here called the genetic fallacy, which just is trying to explain away something by showing how the idea originated. To say that moral values are not objective because our apprehension of them arose through the evolutionary process. That's a textbook case of the genetic fallacy. It doesn't matter how you came to apprehend the moral values. The question is, are they actually real? And the gradual, fallible apprehension of moral values no more undermines the objectivity of moral values than our gradual, fallible apprehension of the physical world undermines the reality of the physical world. If moral values are gradually discovered rather than invented, then their objectivity is ensured.
Next question is from the internet.
Thank you. And this one is for Dr. Mohanty from Becky Levitt at Penn State University. You said that you can't understand unjustified pain, but that we can come to terms with it. I would like to know what you think the source of the evildoer is. What drives man to perform evil?
In my statement, and I did not focus upon moral evil, actually. I was focusing only upon pain and suffering. That means it is not the agent who inflicts evil on others, but it is the recipient who is inflicted upon the pain, which concerned me. That means the agent's temptation to make evil or the propensity, I would be willing to go in for the best explanation that is available. But I could not fit in, which is much more serious, namely the victims, the subjection to unmerited pain and suffering, which seem to me not to fit into any of our neat worldviews. So I don't have ready-made a theory of what leads people to moral wickedness. Actually, there would be what Aristotle called weakness of the will. There may be many other factors which contribute to it, actually. Temptation.
It's very important to point out here. It's a very good question. Even in Hinduism and Buddhism, it became an inescapable struggle. Gautama Buddha, who dealt with dukkha, the problem of pain and suffering so much, even he could not escape human instigation in this. And in one of his sermons, brought in the fact that suffering and evil had human agency to it. And the whole law of karma, which comes as the wheel of reincarnation and the inheriting of either part or the totality of your previous incarnation, the karmic law protagonists, first of all, never try to explain how it entered, a question that Dr. Craig asked earlier. But then you're paying in every reincarnation. And so human agency comes in there too. And so while the victim may be an important facet here, all of the major religious worldviews do not know how to struggle with this instigator factor. And it's fascinating, even to hear Dr. Bernard Leikind here a moment ago. All the bad things that he talked about were given to God. All the wonderful cures we brought about. You see, this is some kind of duplicity going on in here. You know, you just can't accept as if any goodness has come from him.
Let's take an example of the struggle in Yugoslavia, which is taking place between Catholic people who believe Jesus, and I assume nearly everything you believe, and Eastern Orthodox people also believe in the godliness of Jesus and something similar to your views, and a Muslim people who have the idea that Jesus was a great teacher, and probably if we went and asked them, they'd all agree there were some absolute moral values, and yet no one can figure out what they are, and they're slaughtering one another. So even if you think there are absolute moral values, you're still confronted with the problem of how in this life you have to decide yourself whether to behave, what you are going to do every day. And most people who are doing evil things, like these people in Yugoslavia, don't believe that they're bad and evil people. They think that, the Serbs think that they're moral in defending their society and the whole world's wrong and against them, and they're so every one of those people believe, even though I believe they're creating evil, every one of them believes that they're behaving in a moral, good way.
I think there's a very important, you've raised an important point, and I think it's a point that is a dark blotch upon history. Yeah. The religious wars, the deadly scourge that people in the name of God have perpetrated. But Dr. Leikind, I think there's an important point of difference to note. The logical outworking of atheism allows for what you've just said. Let me finish my point here now. A man like Stalin, a man like Mao. Stalin made a definite change in his religious commitment while he was at seminary and decided he no longer could believe in God and ruled over a people obliterating 15 million of his own people. Logical outworking of his belief that man was whatever you defined him to be. There was no objective moral value. When you take somebody who in the name of religion and the name of God would do this, that's not in keeping and consistency with the name of the person and the teaching of Christ. That's radically inconsistent. Saddam Hussein today, as one of my colleagues was pointing out over the BBC, Saddam Hussein today may call his country a democracy, but we would hardly uphold Iraq and what is being done there as that which epitomizes democracy. Changing labels on an empty bottle doesn't make any difference. What's inside needs to be labeled. So when you take the example of religious people, it is important to point out that they may be doing these horrible, terrible things outside and inconsistent with what they claim to believe. But in atheism, there is a possibility to logically connect it, and that's the fearsome thing.
Yes, so let's go over to a call. We've got a question over here, if we can. Dr. Leikind. Your question for Dr. Leikind? Go ahead.
Where's the question coming from?
I had a question for Dr. Leikind here. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is for Dr. Leikind. If society is moral lawgiver, then can you define exactly what society is? Because I come from a country where they pray cows, and my son will be calling them steaks down the road.
Sure, that's my country. They will be praying to cows, but my friends will be calling it steaks down here.
If society is answer to everything, yes, can you define what it is?
Right. Well, there are many different countries, and I would want to call it a society. So, in some regard, your society overlaps with ours. We have common human aspects, but we've also lived apart, and all of us are trying experiments to find what is the moral system that will help us fulfill ourselves and for our society to be most successful. So, your society is trying out whether it can succeed without eating beef. And here in America, we're doing our best to eat as many of them as we can. And there are many more cows around because we're eating them. And so no one knows what history will show as to which way is the best way.
So I change my society every time I fly on the other side, and then change it again when I come back here.
Well, if you travel from one society to another, you always have the difficulty of fitting into the new society. And you have to decide whether you're going to change to adapt to the new one or whether you are going to try to maintain your own values. This is the famous problem of immigrant societies.
Question from the internet.
Yes, this is for Dr. Zacharias. This is from Lowell Haig at South Dakota State University. He says that 6.5 years ago, I lost my sister to a very aggressive form of breast cancer. I watched her fight and go through 1.5 years of hell. Was there a divine purpose to this suffering that my sister endured prior to her death? After all, she was a devout Christian. Was her suffering deserved? Why did God allow her to endure so much pain? These are questions I have been struggling with since she died.
Did he say the questioner's name was Lowell?
Yes.
What was the first name of the questioner?
Lowell Haig.
Yeah, Lowell, I appreciate you raising this. I think this is at the heart of what it is all about, and all of the platitudes and the theories that we can give to you may seem country miles away from where you're really struggling and coping with this. So let me tell you this. From the point of view of a naturalist, there is no explanation. You need no explanation. She just happens to be here, part of the furniture of the universe. She's dead. She's gone. You're never going to see her again. You have to find some way to come to terms with it, and there is no explanation, no answer for it. But in the purposes of God, within the Christian framework that I give to you, the God who has fashioned this world, who loves you, values you, gives you intrinsic value, reminds you that this 80 years and 10 is not the only years that you have, that within this framework of this time, you and I, many of us can go through suffering. I've buried both my father and my mother. I have been with people where I've seen an awful lot of tragedy come, but 2 or 3 things happen. Number one, because I know the script, I know that is not the last line in your sister's life. Number two, Jesus Christ has said to us that he is the resurrection and the life, that the hope of the resurrection does give you the possibility of seeing your sister again. Number three, he has promised to be a comforter to you in your time of need and give you strength and somehow sustain you through this, and not only sustain you, but use you to strengthen others who go through the same struggle. Professor Eleanor Stumpf of St. Louis University talks about what she calls the mirror of evil. In the mirror of evil and in the mirror of pain, you might see the reflection of the goodness that does come in these settings. And the only possible goodness is within the Christian theistic framework. You move out of that, and there is no other goodness that you can look for. It's just a given. She's gone. He will sustain you. He restores the life of the one who trusts in him, and he enables you to help meet needs of those who go through similar situations. I can assure you there's as much meaninglessness from those who never endured such tragedy. But through this tragedy, I think God walks with you and strengthens you and sustains you. And it may be that you will find the kind of strength in this that many people will never see, except for the tragedy that God has entrusted you with to go through. If God doesn't exist, the question is a moot point, and there is no other way to respond to it other than that it just happened. I think I could give you the hope that Christ will strengthen you, sustain you, and be the restorer of life too, because he died and rose again to show you that in his own suffering, he did not conquer in spite of the dark mystery of evil, he conquered through it.
Question over here. Question over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, my first scenario is just kind of hypothetical, but would it be wrong for me if I was socially raised this way to come up and attack you? If that wasn't wrong in my society, I understand that, that I could be arrested for that and whatnot, but there's laws made by lawmakers, and therefore my actions to you are morally set by those lawmakers, and therefore God is the same way with morals as the lawmakers are to laws. And without the laws, or without the lawmakers, then everybody would just be riotous and there would be no laws. So without God, there would be no morals.
Okay. Anybody on the panel? Dr. Craig?
Well, I think it's more for Dr. Leikind.
I think so too, yeah. But he is big.
I've really, I addressed that somewhat before, that we ourselves are the makers of our morals. But I have a question that's related to this for my colleagues on the panel, and that is, if I know this is exceedingly unlikely, but if I managed to say something that persuaded them that God didn't exist, I'd like to know what's the first sin they have in mind. What is on their list that they aren't doing because they know God's up there and has made this list of things that are right and wrong?
I think you asked the wrong question. Because, first of all, by the way, I'm not sure your question's really been answered here, because are you satisfied with that, or do you want us to proceed?
No, I'm not real satisfied.
Okay.
Would it be wrong for him to attack you? Is that the question?
I think so. Yes, yes, it would be.
Let's narrow it down to laws of lawgivers and the need for laws.
Yeah, right. You'd either have a fight on your hands or see my back. I think it's wrong for you to attack me because of our society and As you say, the laws that we have, I mean, we have that particular thing, that's called assault and battery, and so we have embodied our moral thought in our law in this particular case. But not everything that is moral or immoral is in our laws. But we create all of them. We create them.
There is a difference between the moral law agency in human government and the way God works in the human heart. And I think that may implicitly answer Dr. Leikind's question to us. When I came to know Christ, part of my struggle took me through a bit of suicide. I had no hope, I had no desire to live, I had no confidence in anything that I was capable of doing. And what God did in my life is not just changed what I do, He changed what I wanted to do. And there's a world of a difference when you serve one you love, who, and by the way, in the slavery question too, I think you ought to read the book of Philemon in the New Testament. Paul rescues a slave and sends him back to the person who had him, and he said, I want you to take him now as your brother, and I'm sending him to you as my son. To change the laws of society doesn't change the hearts of society. God always went to the root of the problem. Laws get us, as we have seen and displayed these last few days, one of the few things we've agreed on here, that what's happened is that you can change things externally, but what God wants to do is change us in what we do. And that transformation and change is the work of God within a human life. And that's when He gives you a different perspective on both evil and pleasure, because you serve out of love, not out of a sense of fearing a judge.
Question from the internet for Dr. Mohanty.
Yes, for Dr. Mohanty from Robert at Auburn University. Christians believe that in Jesus' death on the cross, we see a transcendent personal creator demonstrating His love for humanity and displaying His judgment against human evil. Christians further maintain that this meaning of Jesus' death has been verified for all people by Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Have you examined the historical evidence for the resurrection, and what have you concluded about this central event of the Christian faith?
Well, why to me, actually? One thing is that I have not examined, I think the answer would be very simple. I have not examined the historical validity of this evidence, and I have not examined or have not found any incentive from my own thinking and from within my own tradition to examine it, whether it has any lessons for me. So it falls outside the internal thinking process and from within the tradition from within which I think, which is the tradition of Indian thinking as well as the main line of Western philosophy.
Any other comments? Let's see if we can take another question here. Question from, somebody help me out here. Question over here.
Yes, my question is for Dr. Craig. Dr. Craig, I'm troubled by Dr. Mohanty's failure to go the final mile and identify a giver of the objective laws that he is willing to accept. I wonder how and you have investigated, Dr. Craig, and written on the historical evidence of Jesus' resurrection. What does the historical fact of the resurrection, how does that help you to establish or take comfort in a moral lawgiver, someone who has given us this objective morality for us to follow?
I think that we have an intuitive sense of many moral values, which is why the humanist, the atheist, the Christian alike all share many of the same values about the basic dignity of human beings and so forth. But on the other hand, there are areas of moral ambiguity. There are gray areas as well as areas of black and white. And in those areas, I think we need divine revelation. We need guidance from God as to what our moral duties are. Perhaps divorce would be an example that Dr. Leikind raised. This is something where perhaps we don't have natural intuitions, but that God has a plan for marriage and a certain way in which he wants this to be carried out. And so we need a revelation from God to tell us what God's will is on these areas of ambiguity. And I think that Jesus claimed to be the absolute revelation of God. He claimed to reveal God the Father to humankind. And the question that we as rational thinking people need to raise is there any good reason to think that Jesus of Nazareth was telling the truth, that he was who he claimed to be, or was he just a deluded maniac? And I think in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, we have, as it were, God's vindication of the radical personal claims that Jesus of Nazareth made to be the revelation of God, for which he was crucified. As you said, I did my doctoral work in theology under one of the world's great systematic theologians, Wolfhard Pannenberg, precisely on this area. And I found that the historical credibility of the resurrection of Jesus is remarkably good. And I've discussed this on a number of occasions with leading New Testament critics who are skeptical of that event. And I have been shocked again and again to see the desperate lengths to which skepticism has to go to explain away the evidence. So I would see that connection to your question in that way, that the resurrection of Jesus gives us good empirical grounds for believing Jesus was the revelation of God, and that therefore we can take his teachings from God as being God's will on certain moral matters.
Next question from the internet for Dr. Ravi Zacharias.
Okay, this is from 3 students watching at the University of Illinois. How does the Christian worldview address the question of suffering that results from natural disasters, where the cause of the suffering cannot be related to man's choices or actions?
Well, yeah, that, I think, one of the reasons I even did not include it in my main text, because I was just about certain that this question would emerge, and it ought to emerge, because I think it is the most thorny issue for theism, and it is a thorny issue for every form of explanation of evil and suffering. Within the Christian framework, first of all, you have to realize that God in his created order is not just talking about creating us as human beings and in his image. He's talking about creating the whole order of the universe as we know it. And within that relationship, there is a solidarity. There is a solidarity both amongst in humanity, so that what I do in some way or the other affects others. When Professor Mohanty was giving the instance of a baby dying, for example, it affects the parents, it affects the community, it affects society, and we all reel with it, even though that child may not be ours. Whether we like it or not, in some way the Holocaust affects all of us, although many of us had absolutely nothing to do with it. Many of us were not alive when all of that was being engineered. And in the same way, in the physical universe, when humanity rebelled against God, one aspect of the answer is that there was a fallenness of all of creation. The Apostle Paul talks of all of creation groaning. And some of the natural disasters that have come have happened as a result of human errors and wrong types of uses and treatments of all the resources that we have. But where that has not happened and the tragedies do entail, then what we need to recognize is that it reminds us very quickly of at least one thing. We are not infinite. We are not all-powerful. That there is a way we recognize our finitude and our dependence. And in the natural order, there is as much of the capacity of this happening as there is within the human order. Now, when you lift the question, though, even though you give it the connotation of a physical nature of this, and there are other aspects, Dr. Craig in his writings has dealt with this too, the fact is, it is still a morally rooted question. The morally rooted question is that this is not the way it ought to be. And that connectedness is vitally important to remember. So the connection is both with the natural disasters and it connects to a moral nature. And for somebody who says there is no moral objective values, the question itself destructs. But if there is a created order and fallenness is a fact, then I think the physical order will have the same entailments. Reverse the question. Suppose nothing ever happened in the physical order to do this. A boulder fell down and God interrupted and moved the life away from the boulder, although no human agency was involved in pushing the boulder down. Think of the entailments of that you are then asking for a completely reconstructed form of human existence and physical reality. But I see Dr. Leikind is eager to get in here, and I want to give him some time.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on this idea of that humans have fallen in some way, the fall of man, which is being offered as a possible explanation for some of the evil that afflicts us. And the fall of man refers to Eve listening to the serpent and outsmarting her husband and tricking him into eating the apple also. And because of this, all humanity has suffered, right? Women bring forth their children in pain, and men have to bring forth their food from the sweat of their brow. And I say that it is immoral to punish everyone for the sin of one.
Last question of the night here.
It is very, can I say one thing? It's very interesting when you listen to a naturalist like this. They ask all these questions about origin from a theistic framework. I have never seen them ask questions of the Big Bang that they would ask of any other bang. So I want to say.
Invite me back.
As well as the value judgment that this is immoral.
Right. Anyway,
that's what strikes me as so odd.
Invite me back, and we'll discuss the Big Bang.
We'll make this the last question of the night, and then we will have a wrap-up from Dr. Ravi Zacharias.
This question is for Dr. Leikind. Dr. Leikind, in your opening statements, you mentioned that the universe has no purpose, and life has no intrinsic meaning. Morals are the result of evolutionary imprints. And if nothing does have meaning, with all due respect, sir, why should I attribute meaning to your words?
What I said was that there is no meaning outside of meanings that we ourselves as human beings construct. So there was no meaning before there were humans, and all the meanings that we have, including the meanings of my words, come from my mind and heart and were sent to you. All of the meanings in our life. The questioner who asked about his sister who suffered from breast cancer, the meaning of that comes from her and from him and from the people who knew her, and they will find meaning in her life. The fact that he loved her, if she was a good person, if she did good, and the loss that he suffers, all of those are the meanings, and they come from us. There's no outside agency that gave meaning to any of this.
I want to thank you for being a part of the Faith and Science Lecture Forum, and first of all, how about a round of applause for our panelists here? I would like to invite Ravi Zacharias for our final comments, and again, thank you for your participation.
Well, I want to thank the Faith and Science Forum Lectureship for making this possible and for giving me the honor of addressing this terrific audience. And I understand there are about 100 countries involved in listening in and numerous websites. I'm honored. Dr. Leikind, thank you for being a good sport. His writings actually carry an awful lot of wit. A lot of what I've written, he's a brilliant man and does a lot of witty work. And walking on fire is one of his hobbies, so the fireworks did not trouble him one bit here tonight, I'm sure. And Dr. Mohanty, as the more I read your writings, I wish so much I'd had the privilege of studying under you, sir, at some time. Although our conclusions and our philosophies are worlds apart, I would have enjoyed the opportunity of just listening more to you. And Dr. Craig, we were classmates in our graduate school, and it's just a terrific idea to have our friendship go back. I deeply admire this man. I hope you pick up his books. What you have noticed here very quickly is this. For the naturalist, no purpose, no meaning. You make your own meaning, both public and private. No moral absolutes. It is plainly unlivable. It is a philosophy that is unlivable, and you notice that again and again. Moral judgments were made. It's drawn in. As Jean-Paul Sartre, on his deathbed, as an atheist, acknowledged that his non-theistic, atheistic framework became plainly unlivable. It deals with properties of the universe and ignores some very important aspects like love, truth, logic, evil, goodness. but they are somehow dealt with pragmatically. And if you want to read their writings, you'll see this constantly going on. Some of the articles in Skeptic magazine just leap out on these matters, and it just shows the struggle to deal with moral issues while denying moral objectivity. The struggle, I think, that the religious atheistic position that Dr. Mohanty has, I think, so well represented is that in Hinduism, Buddhism particularly, there was a tug, a constant tug to anchor this some way. That's why Hinduism developed this tremendous strand of theism, because karma and reincarnation, good and evil, could not be grounded. Even Gautama Buddha used terms like heaven and hell, even though in classical Buddhism it is non-theistic and atheistic. What this proves for all of us is a struggle to find personhood, struggle to find relationship, struggle to explain what is good and what is evil, and find meaning that is there not just for me, but that is meaningfully meaning because it has an objective reality to it. I close with this illustration and this thought. A professor from Moody Bible Institute, Charles Cooper, told us the story once to a large audience, how after marrying this lovely young lady, they'd been married 4 months, he was only in his 20s, he went to pick her up at O'Hare International Airport, saw the plane pull into the jetway, and his mother-in-law was standing next to him as he went to the door to see his young wife come back from a business trip. And the mother-in-law, looking at the back of the plane, noticed police cars, ambulances, and all of them rushing to the back. And then she noticed a stretcher being taken through the back of the plane, and noticed then beyond that, that the purse of her daughter was hanging on that stretcher, and it was covered with a sheet. There was obviously a dead body underneath that. She went over to Charles, this terrific black young theologian, and grabbed him by the arm, and she said, "Charles, that's her purse." To make a long story short, he found out she had suffered from a completely unprecedented heart attack, never had a heart problem, died 10 minutes before they touched ground at Chicago. Charles Cooper spoke to an audience larger than this, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I got letters, I got cards, I got telephone calls. They were all helpful. But the most important thing to me through that whole ordeal was to know and to depend on the character of God. To know and depend on the character of God. This is our hope. Is God who he claims to be? It is not a moral law above him or beneath him. It emerges from his very character. How do we know what God's character is? Look at one of the staunchest skeptics' description of the character of Jesus. The character of Jesus has not only been the highest pattern of virtue, but the strongest incentive in its practice, and has exerted so deep an influence that it may be truly said that the simple record of 3 short years of active life has done more to regenerate and to soften mankind than all the disquisitions of philosophers and all the exhortations of moralists. That verdict comes from a skeptic. I wish I had time to go on to even what Bertrand Russell said on this. I close with this paragraph. This same Jesus wept at his friend's grave, even though he knew he would momentarily raise him from the dead. He understood what it was to live with pain and death and that kind of reality. But he told the onlookers, "I am the resurrection and the life." When you know him, you understand how he answers not only in propositions, but in a relationship. An Indian gentleman once said to me in Bombay 2 years ago, he said, "Mr. Zacharias, my daughter was killed in a plane crash, and I have struggled over these years to come to grips with it." He had listened to a series of lectures I'd given there. Here's what he said: "I used to think time was a healer. I do not believe that anymore. I now know that time is only a revealer of how God does the healing." And I present that God to you who sent his son to the cross, the one whose character, without blemish,